Okay, so it looks like we
Yeah,
are live.
I think we're on. When did that happen?
I know, right? So welcome everyone who's listening to us live or who is
Seeing us live, not just
right,
listening.
yeah, and also anyone who might see us in their feed later. Thank you, Facebook's algorithm. Um, I'm Rebecca Keller. I'm head of geopolitical analysis here at RANE. This is my colleague, Sam Lichtenstein. I'll let him introduce himself, and then we're going to talk to you guys about our annual forecast.
Yeah, that sounds very dangerous, Becca, but I'll at least pretend to have an official title. I'm our
Yeah.
Director of Global Security Analysts. So whereas Becca heads up our geopolitical economics forecasting section, I'm going to be speaking more specifically about our security forecasting.
And I think what's important for our viewership to hear is that those things are all very intimately tied because you can't have one without the other. Geopolitics, inherently, as we define it here at RANE, is the intersection of all of those pillars and drivers. So, yeah. Before we kick off about what our key calls are this year, I think it might be a little bit useful for us to talk about exactly how we forecast. Do we have a crystal ball in the back room, we put on our capes, that kind of thing? Or how exactly do we go about this process? I will go ahead and kick that off. This has been the foundation of the company's forecasting, or the company itself, since it was Stratfor for over the last several decades. And it is the skeleton or the scaffold with which we do all of our analysis. We look at trends not just in a single camera shot of time, but we look at them across decades. We look at them in shorter periods too. So it's an ongoing, developing, living process.
Yeah, and that makes it sound really a lot better than my usual forecasting method, which is operating on a fake it till you make it mentality. This brings a little more structure to that process. And this year was, of course, very different in how we had to go about forecasting because, of course, the pandemic has made it sadly impossible for our whole team to gather as it normally would. But we had a really unique opportunity back in November where, after being remote and separated from each other, Becca and I, having worked together even for a full year, had not actually met in person, nor had I with any of the analysts. We were all able to come together in Austin, where most of our analyst team is based, and get together in a hotel and actually, in a safe capacity, put together these forecasts, which was just such an incredible experience for the team because you show up and you're like, you're very tall and I don't recognize you the way you are on video, but I recognize your analysis and that's all that matters.
Exactly. And I think that was also so important because forecasting is such a collaborative process. It's about throwing anything that will stick against the wall and really looking at all of the factors at play and doing, and we can do a lot of our job remotely. We've been blessed in that sense, but that's one of the aspects where it really was beneficial to have the whole team together.
Absolutely. Yeah. That collision of ideas is the only way to produce really great analysis. And we can really do a lot remotely, as Becca said, but being together in person and having those one-on-one dialogues and just being able to understand each other in a non-screen environment like we are now was so impactful. And I mean, I don't know about you, Becca, but on my flight back to New York, where I live, I was just so energized after that weekend. And the nerd analyst in me that loves talking about these things was just on such a high of like seeing these ideas come to fruition and seeing people engage with the topics in a way that they just quite frankly hadn't been able to do through the computer.
Right. And I think it just made the forecast all that stronger and really allowed our geopolitical economic forecast to sync much better with our security forecast. So we have two platforms, we have two ways to view our content, but actually we have three. I think this really synced up the two separate annual forecasts in a way we really hadn't in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were certainly the beneficiaries of that and being able as a security team to sit down with the analysts that typically cover more political economic topics and literally pick their brains about, all right, what are the things you're looking out for? Because what does that mean we have to look out for? Because in the world of geopolitics and economics, as Becca said at the start, it doesn't stay there. It automatically goes into a security realm. And that means there are a whole large number of risks for organizations and readers that care about these issues to take what ostensibly may start as political speech or an economic policy, and then think through the cause and effect of, all right, well, how does this have a security outcome? And particularly, what are the risky outcomes that we have to be aware of? And that's one of the really great things about our forecasting that I really want to highlight, is that while we're looking for, of course, the baseline most likely scenario, we're also looking to identify the ones that are on the margins, the ones that may not be as likely, but perhaps may be more impactful. And those are definitely some of the things we can highlight with some of the people that are watching us right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And from there, we can go ahead and get started with the highlights from our annual this year. I think what's still on everyone's mind, as you can see us in our homes, is COVID. We are entering the third year of COVID. And is there an end in sight? And I think that this year is a turning point. Unfortunately, we're not going to, be all unicorns and rainbows and say that COVID's going to be over. But this is the year where countries and governments start implementing or continue to implement in greater fashion live with COVID policies. COVID is going to be an endemic issue that we will continue as a globe to deal with in different ways, but it's not going to be the driving factor by the end of the year that it was for the past 2 years. So I think that's sort of the big, non-story of the year, I guess, is that we will learn to make COVID not the story once again. And what does that do for the global economy? It does get it, moving, but it's slow. It's slow because everyone is doing that at a different pace, much like we as individuals have different comfort levels with living with COVID. Nations also have that political will and social drive to move at different paces as well, or economic drivers to move at different paces. So it's going to be a gradual outcome in terms of how it benefits the global economy. And then on top of that, you've got inflationary pressure and high energy prices. So it's not looking great for global economic growth this year. So we do expect a slowing of overall average global economic growth. And that obviously is going to have some security implications.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are kind of the big meta economics topics that people tend to bin as, oh, this is dollars and cents proverbially, but it also has very clear on the ground implications. I mean, one very timely thing I want to talk about for a second here, Becca, is Kazakhstan. So obviously, there are a whole lot of other issues in the background in Kazakhstan, but I think it's really notable that the immediate trigger for this massive wave of unrest that we've seen was this spike rise in diesel prices. This was something that was going to be phased in at the start of this year. It had been planned, but all of a sudden you see the very clear impact of a discrete price boost causing people to come into the streets. And this is one of those instructive examples where you can note how there was this immediate trigger and then there were all these background issues. And so both having that economic trigger for the immediate protests, but also having the larger political economic unrest story in the background is a great example of that crossover between our two main platforms, between kind of the geopolitical economic side and the more discrete on the ground, how does this impact organization side? And we already know, I mean, from some of our clients that have interest there that truly have real, security concerns about personnel that's on the ground, infrastructure, property that they have based there. So you can really see kind of how in the meta world of these dollars and cents questions, for clients that have personnel that they are responsible for their safety, this is a real proverbial life and death question for them. And tragically, given the deaths that we've seen there, I mean, this is not an abstract thing. This is real life.
Right. No, absolutely. And I'm going to turn us away from that incredibly uplifting point that you just made there, Sam.
I do security background.
I know.
Good. I'm sorry.
You give me my positive dose every morning, Sam. No, I think, turning to what are the other big global stories of the year. And I think, again, much like the economy, it's the same story we have been telling for the last several years. It's just the next step. And that's in the US-China relationship. And much like our other trends, we don't see this ebbing anytime soon. We can see a continued pressure between those two global powers. the Biden administration has shown that it will continue to remain hard on China, and the tariffs likely aren't going anywhere. We haven't seen a move to remove them yet, and we'll continue to see similar pressures from China on Western businesses that they see as contradicting their national line. So that's going to move apace as it has been in the previous years. And I think two hotspots that we're looking at are Hong Kong and China, or Hong Kong and Taiwan. So in Hong Kong, we see COVID coming into play. So you've got Hong Kong following China's COVID policy, which really is among the strictest in the world. It's still zero COVID, where much of the world is shifting to live with COVID. And in doing so, Hong Kong is disadvantaging itself somewhat as a financial hub and a business center because it doesn't have that renewal of economic activity. Additionally, we see a indication that we're going to see an uptick in the use of the national security law, which is only going to further restrict freedom of speech and abilities for individuals at foreign companies to operate and live in Hong Kong. So we see an acceleration of Hong Kong's integration into mainland China this year. And obviously there's the potential, goes back to those low likelihood but high potential or high risk situations that you were talking about earlier, where we haven't seen that resurgence of protests since 2019, but there remains a small possibility that we could see significant unrest again.
Absolutely. And this is one of those cases exactly, Becca, where it's important to think through what is the proverbial worst case scenario. As you mentioned, we don't see this massive outpouring of unrest as likely, in large part because the tragic story is that the authorities in Beijing have really clamped down so hard and have exerted their influence over the territory's security apparatus. However, we do know that there's this major undercurrent of discontent. And one particular thing to think about that could drive future unrest is you don't necessarily need to see this massive outpouring, but as the clampdown continues, do you start to see a more militant fringe? And even if it's very small and it's just a few people or even a single lone actor here and there, which is a few cases we've already seen, those people are theoretically more motivated and therefore they present a greater threat. And we know that from Beijing's current policies there, were there actually to be a serious violent incident or even one that was just accused of happening, which we saw last summer with some arrests, you can absolutely expect a further clampdown. And that's going to have a whole host of implications, not only on the security front, but then secondarily, politically and economically, because of course, Hong Kong, as you note, has historically really been organizations' kind of entree into Asia and mainland China. And as the business environment there becomes much more complex, as you start to see the territory move in closer alignment with regulations in Beijing, as you start to see the freedom of movement, freedom of speech, et cetera, slowly wither away, is the territory going to be a place where Western businesses want or even can operate in a way that is really beneficial for them?
Right. And then so what are your alternatives? Singapore is the one that always sort of comes to mind, but there is an opportunity sort of upside to that for areas and cities or even nations that are looking to provide that physical location and connectivity. And then the other China related forecast that we have is the one that tends to grab a lot of headlines in the mainstream media. And I mean, I'll be honest, we definitely had our own clickbait title in this game of, but does China invade Taiwan? And so that's the title, but the answer is no, not this year. And the reasons for that, really go back to the economic constraints that both countries are facing. We will continue to see that escalation of diplomatic pressures, regulatory pressures, but it has a ceiling, and that ceiling is the semiconductor sector, because there's been so much pressure on that sector. Anyone who's tried to buy a car in the last couple of years knows that there are massive shortages there and in supply disruptions in that strategic sector. So both China and that sector is fundamentally important to both China and Taiwan. And so both governments will seek to protect it and will not escalate to the point of hurting that sector. However, and I think this is a really important point about forecasting, timelines matter. So yes, that's the forecast for this year. China will not invade Taiwan this year. But if we look a decade down the road, our forecast doesn't necessarily stay the same, because then the economic constraints wane and you have those political, those social, those security imperatives from a military standpoint, for China that come into play and have greater weight than maybe the economics does 10 years down the line.
All right. Well, I want to go on record, and I want all the viewers to be watching this, Becca, because you accused me earlier of never giving you good news. It sounds like, at least for this year, that there is a somewhat quote unquote good news story. We are not going to expect war, invasion, et cetera, despite headlines we saw at the end of last year about kind of China sending in planes to invade Taiwan's air defense zone. These things are not indicative of conflict. Now, I'll caveat that. I'll still give you some bad news. Don't worry. I'm still me. The cyber risks that we've started to see emanating from Beijing, targeting people of Taiwanese descent, targeting Hong Kongers, and most importantly, targeting people of Chinese descent and Chinese critics abroad, are definitely something that we're going to want to watch out for, because this is an area where China can really expand without necessarily kind of escalating to the point of conflict. And we've started to see Beijing engage in a lot more ambitious and escalatory cyber surveillance of dissidents, including not just political ones, but also business ones, putting malware on people's phones to surveil them, inserting backdoors, which they could exploit in the future, even if they're not doing now. And given the fact that we know that the Olympics are a very high profile event for Beijing to be hosting next month, to be followed by a party congress later this year that's going to be very politically intense, we know that the last thing the authorities want is any sort of dissent. And if 2020 and 2021 were any signs of what we can point to going forward, the idea of Beijing continuing to monitor dissidents abroad that poses a threat to a number of organizations' personnel and their operations, this is definitely a space to watch, all completely apart from China's very clear intent to continue to engage in things like economic and political espionage on a state level. To actually target the employees of organizations is definitely a risk that people need to bear in mind.
No, very, very true. And that actually is a great transition. It's amazing how you do that, Sam.
So
Because
this is what I'm here for.
cyber is this key link between the two forecasts this year, because cyber is becoming more and more of a strategic threat than ever before. And so what is the biggest cyber threat that you see coming down the line this year?
Well, let me start out by saying everybody should unplug their computers. They should turn off this Facebook Live and just hide under the bed, because the amount of cyber threats out there are vast. They are growing. They are diversifying. And crucially, they're no longer just targeting governments. They're no longer just targeting big organizations or even small organizations. They're affecting individuals in a very personal way. And that means that our cybersecurity hygiene, and I think that's a good way to think about it, needs to be improved. We've all, unfortunately, in the past 3 years, gotten very familiar with the idea of personal hygiene, washing hands, etc. The same thing applies in the cyber realm. Practicing good behaviors when it comes to our cybersecurity practices is only going to become more important. So to answer your question about the biggest threat, my easy answer is all of them. If I had to pick, though, I would look at two particular trends to be concerned about. The first is the increasing blurring of the lines between what used to be primarily nation state actors, your China, Russia, Iran, North Koreas of the world, typically what we call the big four, that really used to be focused almost entirely on gathering very strategic economic or political intelligence. And this meant that their primary targets were going after either governments or very, very large companies with massive, let's say, intellectual property value or data that they wanted to steal. As the line blurs, though, between nation states and criminal and hacktivist groups, the motivations of nation states are going to become even more diverse. So it may become relevant for a country like Russia, for instance, to invest in going after one kind of niche IT provider if that IT provider is a vendor for hundreds of other organizations that Russia could then compromise in a supply chain hack. Similarly, take the example of Iran. This is a nation state that has typically been very active in going after industrial control systems, which is a particular concern. But primarily one that governments need to worry about, not necessarily private organizations. What we've seen out of Iran recently is that it's willing and has a lot of intent and crucially capability to go and try to compromise organizations solely for a political purpose. So, for instance, we've seen Iranian threat actors compromising targets in Israel solely because they're Israeli, not even in some cases looking to get a ransom or steal some sort of IP, not having any sort of clear economic agenda other than an ideological political one in targeting Israeli firms simply because they're Israeli. So all of a sudden, it doesn't matter whether you're not some sort of major Israeli company that has links to the government. Little companies that are completely unrelated, that have no political kind of relationship whatsoever, all of a sudden they're targets simply because they're in Israel. So you can see how this kind of blurring of the lines in motivations is a concern because it really broadens the aperture of the threat. The second thing I'd really highlight here is not only the broadening aperture in terms of the motivations, but also the geographies. And of course, these two dovetail. So much of 2021 was about the story of ransomware attacks, primarily against major US and Western European companies. And my favorite thing about ransomware gangs is that they like to attract, for at least some of them, attention from media because they like to boast a little bit. And so in some of their, news conferences, quote unquote, that they give, and, these interviews, they will actually come out and say, yes, we're going after US companies because they're rich. And because they're rich, they have money that we want to steal, and therefore we will continue to go after them. And it's just a cycle. And they make this very obvious. They want to go where the money is. And who was the famous bank robber that said, like, why do you rob banks? And he says, because that's where the money is. I'm sure it's an apocryphal story, but it's a great line that everybody knows. And it's the same thing with ransomware gangs. But here's going to be the difference in 2022. If you're a US organization or a Western European one that has a lot of money that could be stolen or ransomed, absolutely, you have to continue to worry. However, what we've started to see is a little bit of the shift in geographic focus for some of these gangs, because as the United States, as the West improves some of its cyber defenses, as they start to go a little bit on the offensive for some of the more escalatory attacks, we're starting to see a little bit of deterrence here and there so that threat actors, not across the board, but at least some of them start to think, okay, maybe going after this major provider of whatever it may be isn't as great of an idea if it's going to cause this backlash. Okay, let me reorient and see, is there more vulnerable targets, say, in Latin America, Asia Pacific, et cetera, places that have been, by comparison, been less targeted, but are actually probably more vulnerable. And if you're a cyber threat actor, maybe your ultimate goal is to make a lot of money, but if that comes at the cost of a lot of attention on you, maybe you decide, okay, I'm going to take a little bit less payout, but also make a lot less noise that's going to attract far less blowback. And so that's a calculation that we're really monitoring to see. And it's those two big threats that I'd highlight in 2022.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, cyber is going to play a huge role in the interim for a couple of different geopolitical trends that we're monitoring. Iran, as you mentioned, Iran targeting Israel, but that also comes into play when we're looking at the ongoing negotiations between Iran and the West with the JCPOA, and looking at how do those negotiations evolve. And this is actually one of those things where we're actually out a little bit out on a limb here this year, where we're counter consensus, where our forecast says that, we still think that the most likely scenario is a limited agreement between Iran and the US that allows for some sanctions to be lifted in turn for some concessions on Iran's nuclear program. It's a 51-49 kind of likely, but it's there. And we think that, again, because of the economic pressures that Iran is under, and because of the really, really strong desire from the West to limit Iran's nuclear program. And so we still think those drivers are more heavily weighted than the driver of the new government in Iran, which is pushing away from a potential agreement. That being said, what happens before an agreement is signed is we expect an escalation in these escalatory measures that Iran has taken in the past, be they in the cyberspace or in the shipping industry. So I think the cyber tactics and the strategic perspective of cyber comes into play there as well.
Absolutely. And I'll go back to being doom and gloom and say, obviously, were in a deal to fail, particularly one where it ends in really acrimonious dispute between the parties, of course, the risks escalate significantly. But I think the really interesting thing to think through here is even if there is a deal, the risks are still manifest. And that's for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, because a limited nuclear deal is only going to look exclusively at nuclear issues. There are still a whole host of disputes, ranging from Iran's backing for proxy militias throughout the region to its missile development program, which is treated separately from its nuclear development. All these types of issues that are still going to be outstanding and which are still going to cause major frictions between Iran and the West. And let's be real, if you're Israel, even if there is a nuclear agreement that you're happy with, and that's, of course, a big, big if, even if that's the case, you have all these other issues in your proverbial and literal backyard that you think, okay, we still need to do something about this, which means that the risk of escalation between Iran and Israel and then Iran and the West, primarily the United States, is absolutely still there. And the cyber domain is a really attractive venue for that competition because unlike in the real world, where you risk significant escalation that could lead not only to a real world incident, but one in which there are actual casualties that we've seen previously in some of Iran's attacks on Middle Eastern shipping. In the cyber domain, there is that element of escalation control where you don't necessarily create a real world impact, let alone one that would cause casualties. Now, if talks break down, that calculation may change and it may become attractive to actually do something with the point of causing destruction that could actually harm human life. But even if there is a deal, you're still looking at a whole host of Iranian and Israeli cyber activity that falls perhaps short of kinetic conflict, but which is going to be nonetheless very threatening to organizations connected to any part of those governments.
Yeah, and if any government knows how to take cyber and use it just short of kinetic conflict, Russia's the government, and that really sort of looks to the other trend that we're really highlighting in our geopolitical forecast this year, and that's how the Russian-Ukraine conflict plays out. We've seen headlines over the last several weeks, if not months, of Russian troop buildup on the Ukrainian border, and the question, much like it is with Taiwan, is when or if does Russia invade? And once again, we don't think a full invasion is what is going to occur. We think that this buildup of troops is to legitimize the strategy, but that the threat is almost more powerful than the actual action would be in terms of Russia's negotiating position with the United States. And as we watch the continued talks between Russia and the United States play out over the next weeks and months, that's something we're looking at. That being said, there are several steps between keeping your troops on the border and fully invading. And this is one of those cases where our scenario planning really comes into effect because of all of those steps in between, and looking at the implications of escalation in Donbass only, looking at all the possibilities and how they could trickle throughout the region. Goes back to Kazakhstan, how does Russia's distraction in Kazakhstan play into their strategy in Ukraine? Nothing operates in a vacuum in geopolitics.
No, and certainly not in Vladimir Putin's head, which is a very scary place, and I certainly never want to feature there.
No.
But you can better believe that these issues are pinging around there in a very maniacal way.
Very, very true. Maybe we go to a slightly less violent potential outcome and look at where does Europe go in its first post-Merkel year, with that leader stepping down and with a new government in Germany and soon to be a new government in France. The power balance in mainland Europe is due for a shift in really that first test post-Brexit. And we expect to see, a moderate government come into play in France, which will then, allow for greater cooperation between the new German government and the French government, which will slowly shift that balance of power to more of the southern part of the European Union. Whether that's good or bad for the economic future of the European Union is a discussion I will probably pull our experts in for, who can tell it much better than I. But that really is the story. And I know we've gotten a lot of questions about the French election, but that French election and that French election outcome really is a domestic France story, because the most likely winners, Macron or other candidates, will have this very similar approaches to Germany. That being said, the implications for domestic insecurity in France and different immigration policies and the potential for unrest, now that is a security story.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to highlight that you were talking about Franco-German cooperation, which historically is an interesting concept to think about. But
Very
maybe
true.
2022 will prove us wrong. What I would say about that angle, Becca, is, as you well know, we have a large number of clients that have personnel and interests on the ground in France. And so the way this election comes into being really matters a lot, not just the outcome. And what's concerning from a security standpoint right now is you have candidates who are promoting anti-Islamic, anti-immigrant, very pro-national security. Even President Macron, you can see him just the other day coming out with a very strong pledge to put more police on the streets. So this is coming to be seen as a somewhat public law and order election. And as that's the case, that's just going to raise the tenor of conversation around some very controversial issues and rhetoric. And so the potential for anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic, a whole variety of types of unrest, or even if I really want to become doom and gloom, actual physical attacks, those things all increase in likelihood. And we definitely don't want to suggest that France is going to implode by any means by these things. No, the state institutions are certainly strong enough to withhold. But there is very clearly a hard left and particularly hard right in France. And as these issues become more discussed in the mainstream in the next few weeks before the election in the spring, you absolutely are going to have more and more rising concerns about what this means for public security in France, which, if I can be so bold, also really dovetails a lot of other issues that we've seen in other European countries, including Germany, where you have this resurgence of right-wing extremism and a lot of concerns over what the presence of right-wing individuals in security agencies, et cetera, means for public security overall. And for clients that have personnel in Germany, France, these places, this is not an abstract concern. They're true concerns that people have over whether simply wearing a yarmulke or going to mosque or doing one of anything that you should be free to do in a society, whether that makes you a target. And for people that have to monitor their personnel security risks abroad, that's a big ask. And that's why it's really important to keep these even domestic stories in mind, because they can have real world impacts.
No, for sure. So far we've covered pretty much the Eurasian landmass. I have visions of one of our senior colleagues talking to me about Mackinder and the importance of, he's a geopolitical name for those who are listening to us. He's
the heartland.
Yes, it's the heartland. And so that's in my head right now, but I want to make sure that we don't ignore what I think are some of our stronger forecasts in emerging markets, because we do cover the whole globe in our annual forecasts. And I think that the Brazilian forecast that we have, looking at how that lead up to election in the country that is mirroring the United States in more ways or one, with its divergence and its really splitting of its political landscape, and seeing how the strategies in an election year and an already ailing economy really put Brazil's economy in a difficult position going into 2023. So 2022 is not the forecast year. That's the election year. That's where you see it all play, the wheels start to turn. But 2023, looking at the weakness and the hardship of the Brazilian economy, especially as we advance even farther in an energy transition where Latin America can play such a huge role in that resource game, it's going to be just really interesting to watch in 2022.
And obviously there are a whole host of unrest concerns in Brazil and a variety of neighboring and other Latin American countries. I mean, you have to only look so far as Colombia last year to see how some very arcane tax policy can really spur unrest that leads to violence and essentially paralyzes a country for a number of weeks on end. I mean, if you're thinking from a perspective of personnel security, from physical security on the ground for your organization, not to mention, of course, tourism and a whole host of kind of just more mundane activities that people engage in. That's a real warning. And so as you're looking across Latin America, there are a whole lot of countries where you look at the factors underlying them and you start to think, oh boy, this really has a lot in common with Colombia. And that's not to by any means suggest that these things are preordained to happen. But as you start to look at the underlying factors, you start to see the risks. And in Brazil, where you have what's going to absolutely be a high profile election, where you have a populist nationalist president who's by no means shy about using incendiary rhetoric, when you have a population that has a number of political and economic grievances, amplified by what we can only describe as unforeseen black swan events.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the risks are absolutely out there. And given Brazil's regional economic and political heft, anything that happens there obviously has a concern about knock-on implications elsewhere.
Absolutely. Are there any other security things that we should be watching out for in the coming year? I mean, obviously there's domestic stuff in the United States in terms of lone wolf actors and continued social unrest. What should our viewership be worried about there?
Yeah, I mean, it's by no means going to shock anybody to remember that we're coming into another election year, believe it or not. It seems like we just left interesting one, to say the least, and now we'll come into a midterm cycle. So I would say the good news is that the unique election of 2020, where you just had a host of factors that are not present or not present as intensely this year, suggests that you're unlikely to see a massive influx of unrest akin to what you saw in 2020. That being said, it is an election year. That being said, political polarization remains as high as ever. You're also going to obviously see a whole host of foreign malign actors ranging from Russia, China, Iran, et cetera, that are absolutely going to be examining how they can interfere. And there are already a whole host of press reports about Russia, China, Iran, et cetera, already doing those exact things. So when you put those together, you definitely have a higher risk profile compared to last year. And I note that this is not just going to come from the proverbial right side of the spectrum, where there have been a lot of concerns, but also as you start to see President Biden get increasingly attacked from the hard left, the potential for extremism on both sides is certainly present. And obviously, as we saw tragically in 2020, the potential for those two forces to clash is, of course, a big concern. Specifically to your one point about lone actors, Becca, this is really where we have the greatest concerns, because a lone actor, unlike a member of a formal organization, really has no checks on his or her actions. When you're a member of a formal organization, usually you're trying to accomplish something, and excessive violence is a detriment to that goal. Even if you're looking at some of the big names that we saw from the militia movement, et cetera, whether it be the 3%ers or a group like the Proud Boys, you've really seen them in the wake of January 6th last year tamp down on a lot of their overt activities. So they're clearly showing that they recognize that they have an image problem and they need to fly a little proverbially more low under the radar. For a lone actor, though, he or she is by him or herself. He doesn't need to kind of adhere to the whims of a larger organization or, be bound by kind of top-down guidance, which means that what he or she does is completely up to him or her. And that's a big challenge because it makes predicting these type of incidents very hard, especially when these actors, by their nature, are quite insular, which reduces law enforcement's ability to kind of observe warning signs, whether it's communications, et cetera. So when you're looking towards the November midterms, yes, we do expect there to be less social unrest than in 2020, which of course was also connected to a whole host of other issues, from Black Lives Matter, the unique personality of former President Trump, et cetera. But yet all of these underlying factors are still there. So you need to be concerned and that there are going to be sporadic events that have security implications, and in some cases could tragically lead to violence, even if it's unlikely to be some sort of mass unrest.
Yeah, no, that actually makes me think too. A really interesting. One thing that I'm actually glad we did this year was to integrate our terrorism forecast into our greater security forecast, because it really shows that shift in threat where it's still present, but counterterrorism doesn't have that like priority that it had in previous years, and you don't necessarily need to pull it out. I know with the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, some might wonder if that is coming back. But on the geopolitical side, we see the Taliban really taking 2022 to hunker down and secure their domestic control, as well as portray some image of legitimacy to the West in order for aid to keep coming in as they try to solidify their control of the country. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about terrorism in general, but I did want to sort of bring that up as a very key shift in security threats this year.
Yeah, well, you used the term counter consensus earlier to describe our forecast about the Iran-US negotiations. I'd say we're also counter consensus here regarding the threat from ISIS Khorasan province. This is tragically, as many viewers probably remember, the group that is basically the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan that carried out the horrific bombing at Kabul International Airport as the U.S. was departing, killed scores of U.S. service personnel, and tragically a lot more Afghan civilians. And since then, has really been prosecuting what could only be described as somewhat of an insurgency against Afghan-led Taliban government, in which basically they've been targeting not only the Taliban, but also a whole host of minority groups, very clearly with the intent of trying to create these societal fissures and plunge Afghanistan back into some sort of civil unrest, if not full-blown civil war. Now, there were a lot of concerns, and rightly so, of course, about the potential for Khorasan's province to target the West. And I think a very key thing here to think about is a distinction between intent and capability. Undoubtedly, if you read the propaganda statements, Khorasan province wants to be proverbially the new bad boys on the street and make the name for themselves. I mean, like any other environment, I hate to say it, but terrorism is business competition. You want to be the top dog. You want to attract recruits and propaganda and funds and attention, et cetera. And there's no better way to do that than to carry out a destructive attack in a major Western city, especially the United States. That being said, there's also a massive capability that's required to do that. And it's because of that thankfully we have not seen that in many, many years. All we've seen, to our conversation earlier, has really been lone actors in small groups, some of whom were inspired for sure by foreign groups and even in some cases communicated with them. But we have not seen the sort of directed attacks where a foreign group is able to train, arm, deploy, and send people to carry out a sophisticated, complex attack in a US or other major Western city. So for ISIS Khorasan province, they face a lot of constraints on their external operations in the West, none more so than in trying to get the Taliban's attention through all of its violence. They've succeeded. And so now they need to kind of straddle this very complex position they've carved out where they're still fairly small. They don't have a ton of societal support, and the Taliban is certainly incentivized to crack down on them. So they're going to be preoccupied with trying to fight off the Taliban, create a niche for themselves, and potentially start to do some maybe cross-border activities into regional countries. But the idea that they're going to be able to launch a complex attack in the West, we are going to judge this year as comparatively unlikely. Again, to your point about timelines, if you expand outward, that intent one day could match capability. But for what we see in 2022, yes, expect more noise, maybe even expect them to be able to connect digitally with some supporters in the West. But what we don't see as likely is them being able to really carry out a complex attack akin to, say, what the Islamic State was able to do in Paris in 2015, which involved actually seeding in operatives from abroad, conducting really horrific attacks that are mass casualty involving explosives, firearms, et cetera.
Okay. Well, on that very, uplifting.
Is that my mom saying hello? Oh my
That's
gosh,
what I thought. I was going to ask, is Marita your mom?
Oh, I think that's fantastic. We're also in her house right now.
Your mom has commented on our Facebook Live, and I love it. I love it a lot. Yeah, no, we could go on and on and on about this. And this is the point where our PR team would tell me to let our viewership know that you can go to our website and subscribe for $1 a month for 4 months. I don't know. I'm probably wrong.
You can go for free.
No, no, you should give us some money. There we go. It is $1 for 4 weeks. Thank you very much, Jeff, our wonderful head of PR there.
That's a pretty good deal, Becca, I got to say.
It is. It's a
I
fantastic
like to think
deal.
our analysis is worth significantly more for that. So that's a very good deal.
I agree. But no, I'm going to take this public venue to say that we have a fantastic team of analysts behind us doing a lot of the legwork for us to sound smart here on Facebook Live. And that we write on these developing trends because, as we said at the beginning, they're not static. They change over time. We are constantly evaluating the information that comes in and how it changes our forecast and how it changes our perspectives. We're doing so in an unbiased fashion. And we hope that you come and read our stuff, whether it be the forecast or our other assessments. And with that, again, we could go on and on for hours on this, but we won't subject you to that. And I will just say,
because we have to get back to producing the good analysis.
Exactly. I think I have a bunch of it to read. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a great rest of your day.